people who identify as lonely are 7 times more likely to get active in politics than people who don't. And so politics seems to give you the illusion of belonging, like I'm a member of Team Red or Team Blue. You're not really in a community. You're not going to community meetings. You're just hating the same people. And politics seems to give you the illusion, which we all need, that we're involved in some righteous cause. But you're not sitting with a widow or serving the poor. You're just tweeting something nasty about your opponents. And so it gives you the illusion that it's going to fill the hole in your soul, but it just brings you to culture war.
We are here with our friend David Brooks, columnist, New York Times. You're all familiar with him, author of How to Know a Person, which we talked about a year or so ago on this show, and I'll link to it again in the show notes. David, thanks for being here.
Russell, great to be with you again. Always a pleasure.
I have been waiting to ask you about something that I have started to ask you about over the past couple of weeks, and I've decided to wait until now. And that is Sam Tannenhaus's new biography of William F. Buckley includes a section about you as a young University of Chicago student writing an essay for Buckley. And it says that at the end of it, you say, if truth be known, I just want a job and I have a peculiar way of asking. So how about it, Billy? Can you spare a dime? And I have to know, is that a true rendering of your early interactions with the great William F. Buckley?
It's absolutely true. I was a humor columnist at the school paper at the University of Chicago. Bill came to campus, and I wrote an extremely mean parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. Some of the jokes were like, at Yale, Buckley founded 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley, the other called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. I can't remember all the jokes, but it was a series of jokes. He had written this book about his wonderful life with limos and trips to Gstaad and movie stars. And so I basically made fun. And I wrote that at the end of my column. And the column was called The Greatest Story Ever Told, about the life of William F. Buckley. And at the end of his speech to the student body, he said, David Brooks, I want you to know, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And that was my big break in journalism. The sad thing was I was actually not in the audience. I had been hired by PBS on my first ever TV appearance to go out to Stanford and debate Milton Friedman. And I was then a socialist college kid, and I'm debating a Nobel laureate on economics. And you can imagine how well that went.
I have seen the YouTube clip of
yeah,
that.
You can go on YouTube and see a picture of me with a lot of hair and these 1980s glasses, these gigantic glasses that look like they are on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory. And he crushes me. It's humiliating. But out of that 1 week, I got 2 mentors. I got Bill Buckley and I got Milton Friedman. And eventually I became conservative and went to work for one of them.
Did you feel as though you fit in the conservative sort of atmosphere of the National Review kind of world at that time?
I did a bit. I had a lot of fun working. Being around the Buckleys, being around Bill, his sister Priscilla, they were, as the book makes clear, they were the most fun things to be around. And he somebody says in the book, Bill could fear anything, but the thing he feared most was being bored. And so he took me out sailing with him. He took me to Bach concerts. It was a level of luxury and a lifestyle I had no idea, even though I grew up about 60 blocks south of where he lived in New York. And so it was incredibly glamorous. And it was an incredibly fun atmosphere. There were a lot of weirdos there. James Burnham was still alive when I was there. There was a guy who later had to get written out of the movement for anti-Semitism. A guy named Joe Sobran was there, but who was still fun. There were weird European intellectuals. There was a guy named Eric von Nudel-Adin. But then other people, George F. Will was around, and a lot of really talented people were around. And it was so much fun working for Bill.
You know, you wrote this piece for The Atlantic that a lot of people have resonated with about how we should have seen this coming with the American right, and talked about your own sense of almost shame in some ways at not seeing some of these things happen. Do you think that the situation the right is in now, is it because some of these figures that you're talking about just now that were fringe and weird turned out not to have been so fringe after all?
Well, I think there were always kooks around National Review. And some of them were kooks, like in the early John Birch Society. Again, George Welch was running that, and Buckley eventually had to read him out of the movement because he was such a conspiracy-minded kook. But that, it turns out, had long legs. Buckley's own father was a member of the American First movement, a real isolationist movement. Turns out that lingered on within the Republican Party even during the Reagan-Bush years. And then the anti-immigration stuff, I mean, we need to control our borders, but there are always some people for whom controlling borders veered into, I would say, ethnic bigotry. And there was a guy named Peter Brimelow I was close to back in those days. So I would say there were people who we thought were like the lunatic fringe, but it turns out they had a lot more strength than we knew. But then the thing I really should have seen is I got to the National Review and then later the Washington Times and later the Wall Street Journal editorial page, three pretty right-wing organizations, in the mid-'80s. And at the same time that people like me and Bill Kristol were coming to it, people from the Dartmouth Review were coming to it, and they're famous now as Laura Ingraham and Dinesh D'Souza. And we were earnestly reading Adam Smith and Edmund Burke and, C.S. Lewis and all that, and Chesterton. And we were pro-conservative. And their job was not to be pro-conservative. They were anti-left. They were into shocking the left. And so you got all sorts of books like liberal fascism and stuff like, let's shock the left. And this actually became a marketing strategy. I remember in the 90s, a publisher said, the way to sell conservative books is not to promote conservative ideas. It's to make the liberals really mad. And if you can make the liberals mad, then conservatives will buy that book. And so it became shock the left. And I remember a moment I described in that piece in, I think, 1986, where some Dartmouth students, more progressive ones, had built a shanty town to protest apartheid. And members of the Dartmouth Review editorial board came in the middle of the night with sledgehammers and knocked it all down, even with some students in there. And that struck me even then as shocking because A, apartheid is really worth protesting, and B, sledgehammers didn't seem like Edmund Burke to me. It seemed more like Goebbels. Those two, I didn't realize the distinction between being pro-conservative and being anti-left. And now a lot of the MAGA movement and a lot of the people who are in that movement who are elite college students like the Dartmouth kids, like Pete Hegseth, who went to Harvard and Yale, and Steve Miller went to Duke, and obviously J.D. Vance went to Yale. They're educated elites who are dissenters within the elite clique of educated elites, more than they are actually tied to a lot of the working class voters who vote for Trump.
What is it about a person's psychological makeup, would you say, that would cause a person to be able to do that? I mean, why would you be a dissenter in that elite community as opposed to somebody who's not?
Well, I understand it. I mean, I eventually didn't go into academia, which is my parents' profession, because I was already turning a little more conservative than you could get a job for in academia. And frankly, I remember thinking I'd go to campuses, and there would always be one conservative. At Chicago, there were more than one, but at a lot of campuses, there were only one. There was the whole campus, and they would have one. And so at Yale, when I was teaching there was a guy named Donald Kagan, a great classicist. And so I remember the panel discussions on any public issue would be 9 liberal professors and Donald Kagan. And then the next night, another panel, 10 liberal professors and Donald Kagan. And I didn't want to be the embattled one. And I'm just not cut out. But some people, they only get a thrill when they're surrounded on the attack. And so when you look at a lot of the people I would call elitists who are super MAGA, like Steve Bannon, a Goldman Sachs guy, I think they like being in the middle of the fight, and they can only get their juices flowing when they're under attack and attacking back. And if you're a conservative person at an Ivy League school, it can be insufferable. And believe me, I've spent my life in these precincts, and things that I remember once, it's a little comment, it's so minor, but I was once in a Washington journalism party, and somebody asked me how many kids I had, and I said, well, I have 3. And they said, oh, is that a right-wing thing? Like, being judged, let alone, especially in New York in the 80s, when people would ask me, I worked at National Review, they'd give me Hitler salutes.
Mm.
And so there was a lot of fascist Nazi calls. And, I was raised Jewish, and the time difference between my birth and the closing of Auschwitz was 16 years, which is not a long time.
Mm.
And so, I was sensitive to some of those Heil Hitler salutes and stuff like that. So it can be genuinely hard to be a minority, a tiny minority in an ideological self-righteous pool. And so I understand why they want to rebel. I would just say it becomes a form of nihilism, and it becomes a form of business that for Rush Limbaugh, for Tucker, who I worked with for 9 years at the Weekly Standard for Tucker Carlson, it became a source of adrenaline. And just like mixing it up with libs, owning the libs, began to replace thinking through an issue clearly.
When it comes to religious students, one of the things that I've noticed on elite campuses, if one goes to Harvard and you meet with the religious students, they're not any Episcopalians or Unitarians or something within the sort of typical Harvard culture, but a lot of Pentecostals. I mean, a lot of Assemblies of God Pentecostals. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I think I as you're speaking, I taught off and on at Yale for 20 years. And I once had a divinity school professor said, he pulled me aside with this quizzical look, and he said, do you know where our best students come from? They come from Liberty University. And he was startled. But I think if you're going to be outside, if you have a grounding in a faith tradition, it can be a source of great pride and a source of great strength and fulfillment. The danger is if you think your theological or your political views are more sophisticated than your professors, the danger is that you therefore then conclude that your views on French history or whatever it is you're studying are also more sophisticated. And so it can produce a kind of arrogance. But I found my teaching all those years at Yale, I tended to draw more religious students than most, I suppose. But the students who I had who were people of faith, mostly some Muslim, but Jewish and Christian, were self-confident and calm and admirable about the way they did. I remember one day we were in class, I was teaching the book of Exodus, and a young woman from Berkeley raises her hand and says, it's so funny. We find this book so repulsive, but back in the day, people used to find it believable. And there were two guys, Jewish kids with kippahs on their heads. So I glance over to them and like, are you guys going to say something? But then that year, it so happens that two of my best students they were not only the best, but they were the most glamorous and good looking and smartest and nicest. They both stood up and said, we're evangelical Christians. And we do believe this. And then they said to the young lady, can we take you out for coffee for a few weeks and just talk it through? And they did that. And she didn't become a person of faith, but believe me, her mind was wide open from that experience.
That's a shockingly mature response from a college student.
They were very mature kids. I know them both to this day. And I would say when I first started teaching in the 90s, to be a religious kid at Yale was embarrassing, like having acne. And by the time I left, it was almost kind of cool because it was a sign you had some spiritual depth. And this was all I left. Well, I guess I left after Trump. But I noticed that evolution. And I say this when I go to a Christian college, that you have what the world is hungering for. You have a formula for spiritual formation. You have a moral vocabulary. You have a way to have access to your heart and your soul. And so be not afraid. And I generally think, and I know this because this was my own personal experience of coming to faith often through visiting Christian colleges, that, wow, these people have it all. And they have a better way to live. They have moral vocabulary. They have a moral order. And the rest of the world is just hungering for that.
I was just, right before we started talking, I was meeting with a group of pastors who were talking about how difficult it is to do evangelism now, because there was a time when it seemed to them that you sort of had a target demographic that you're talking to. You're either in the Bible Belt and you're asking people what happens to you if you die tonight, and then trying to help them have an answer. Or you're in sort of where Tim Keller was in a more urban, educated environment, and you're talking apologetically that way. Now it seems as though all of those categories are mixed together in
Hmm.
strange ways, and it's almost impossible, they said, to train people to learn how to talk about their source of spiritual formation and so forth. Do you see that?
But, and so the point is that Tim would have had one way to talk to urban people, and then there's a whole other language you use if you're talking to maybe something from a rural southern community. Is that?
Yeah, Tim used to talk about how in Charlottesville, his pastoring earned him the right to preach. So he was primarily there in people's homes and doing the things a pastor did. And in New York, it was the reverse. His preaching gave him the right then to be with people in times of needed spiritual formation. It was just two completely different ways of being. But when it comes to sort of talking to people about religious subjects, those categories just seem to be so blurred right now.
Yeah, that does strike me as true. I mean, Tim. I mean, I grew up in New York. And I am one of the sort of people Tim brought to faith, and I am literally one of those people.
Hmm.
And I think the New York bias is show me you're smart before I'll listen to you, and that's a terrible way to be, by the way. But for a lot of people, that's the barrier. To like, can you give me a sermon that I find interesting? And I confess, been church shopping with my wife for a little while, and the number of sermons that regurgitate Christianity 101, God is love, God is love, God is love, and show no sense of curiosity, like let's explore some things. I must say that remains a source of frustration to me,
Yeah.
and maybe that means I'm not as good a person as I should be. I do think I have found I now speak about my faith pretty openly, but I write for the New York Times and the Atlantic. And so I'm writing to a secular audience, and I don't really write it as much because I just don't know as much as people like you or Tim. But so I tell my pastor friends that I'm the gateway drug. I lead them up to you, but I don't give them the final answer. But if you talk honestly about spiritual hunger and moral formation, I just find people flock to those pieces. I just had a piece in the Atlantic, which the audience reaction completely surprised me. It was really about Alistair MacIntyre,
Hmm.
the great moral philosopher, Catholic believer. And to my horror, he died in May. And as far as I can see, no major mainstream media publication even did an obituary of one of the greatest moral philosophers of our
That's
time.
true.
And so I wanted to write something, and I just tried to summarize his work. And you're going back, like one of the points he makes is that in ancient Athens, the idea of asking what is the purpose of my life would make no sense, because the purpose of your life was assigned by your community, by your tribe, your family. You're a farmer, you're a soldier, and same through most of history. And there was a moral order surrounding you. You didn't have to ask what is right and wrong, because you were convinced you were locked in a moral order. And that belief, in my view, lasted until the 1960s. There's a great George Marsden quote about Martin Luther King, that Marsden wrote, what gave King's rhetoric such force was the sense that there was a natural law to the universe, that slavery was not sometimes wrong and other times not wrong. It was always wrong. Segregation is always wrong. Some things are always right and always wrong. And that moral order is woven into the fabric of the universe. And I think over the last 70 years or more, we've said, no, find your own values, find your own truth. And there's no moral order. And way back in 1955, a great columnist, Walter Lippmann, said, if what is right and wrong is what each person invents according to their feelings, then we are outside the bounds of civilization. And we talk a lot about the loneliness and all the epidemics. I think the loss of a shared moral order is a great loss. But if you can assert to people there is a moral order, which MacIntyre did, that piece was the number one read piece in the Atlantic for a week, which, believe me, completely shocked me.
Yeah.
But so there's that hunger for that thing. And I think you can persuade people who are secular that there is an eternal moral order. I think you can persuade people who are secular they do have a soul, that they have some piece of them which has no size, color, shape, and weight, but gives you infinite value and dignity. And what your soul does is it yearns. It yearns for goodness. It yearns for righteousness. I think everybody can relate to that. And once you start talking to people about souls, and this was true in my coming to faith, then you can start talking to people about people as a soul giver. There must be someone who created souls, and maybe that's the Almighty. And so I found it, I think evangelizing, especially if you come from a Jewish background, if you evangelize to me, you are walking on dangerous ground because I hear a lot of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. I hear a lot. Mm-hmm. And yet people who were examples to me of beautiful faith, they didn't have to say a word. Dorothy Day, when I read about her, she didn't have to say a word. She didn't have to evangelize. The message is the person in a case like that. And so many of the people we knew together, I mean, friends of ours, Tim or Mike Gerson, they didn't have to evangelize to me. Their life was an evangel act.
How does a person know whether, say, he's an accountant, he's in a place that's very secular, people he works with, people he meets with in his neighborhood? How do you know when to talk kind of directly about those issues of the soul, and when to just be an example and come at it indirectly?
Yeah, I guess I'm far from feeling like I'm an expert at this, but I guess I would say first, don't make your faith a hidden part of your life. Like mentioned, you learn this at church. You have a friend at church. You were reading this book by this guy named Henry Nouwen, whatever it is. I think I do that all the time now, and I quote Nouwen in pretty much every speech. And I don't always say who he is and what he stands for, his history with L'Arche and all that. But it's part of the crowd of wise people who I bring into conversation. I certainly bring it to my writing. And I do that with Lewis, and I do that with Russell Moore. I quote you all the time. And so it's part of my life. And then as for bringing in evangelizing, I guess the way I do it, I have a conversion story to tell. And so it's begun with my own feebleness and weakness. It's like I'm not like a super spiritual superstar. I watch friends of mine who have way more developed faiths than I do, and I really watch them in direct contact with God. And that doesn't happen to me all that often. I feel like a piker next to really spiritually developed souls. But, you know, I was helped along by Frederick Buechner, who was a pastor and a novelist. And he said, if you're you should wake up every morning and you should read the New York Times. And after you read the Times, ask yourself this question about your faith. Can I really believe that all over again today? Mm. And Buechner said, the answer to that for you is yes, 10 days out of 10, then you don't have a faith like I have. But if I can answer that question, I can believe it all over again 2 days out of 10, and I can do it with great joy and great laughter, then that's the kind of faith I have. And so I found it very comforting in my own journey, and I think it would work for evangelizing, to acknowledge the absences, sometimes moments of intensity, sometimes moments when God's not there. And then just the mystery of it. One story I like to tell is I read Dan Rather once interviewed Mother Teresa. And Rather asked her, when you're praying to God, what do you say? And she said, I'm not saying anything, I'm just listening. And so Rather said, well, what is God saying to you? And she said, he's not saying anything, he's just listening. And if you can't understand those things, I can't explain it to you. And so there's something humble about the awesome mystery of it, which I think it's very attractive when I find people being honest about that.
And of course, Buechner, part of the reason he came to faith was listening to George Buttrick just say the word, that Jesus is crowned in our hearts amid great suffering and great laughter.
Yeah.
And
he was walking down Madison Avenue. I was in a church in Madison Avenue, New York, and yeah.
That's it. You talked about in the piece we referenced earlier about nihilism in the Atlantic, and then in the one that you just did that we were talking about even more recently, You were saying that we don't have a shared moral order. McIntyre, of course, would say the problem happened long before the 1960s.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think when people read the kind of critique that McIntyre had, they tend to think, well, that's just then the time that we're in. There's nothing that can be done about it. So let's just live. What do you think happened to sort of take away that common shared moral order?
Yeah, I think, well, McIntyre does think it all went wrong in the 18th century, and that there was the failure of the Enlightenment project that produced these thin, rationalistic moral orders, which you can only build your life around. And I just don't agree with that. I mean, we have a lot of people who call themselves post-liberals these days, and some on the right and some on the left, and they seem ridiculous to me, frankly. It reminded me when I was really young and I was surrounded by Marxists. And they could spin these lofty stories about how Marxism would lead to beautiful communities and everybody would write poetry in the afternoons. And but I covered the Soviet Union. So I know that that lofty talk turned into a gangster state. And I saw it in the Soviet Union, I saw it in Cuba, I saw it around the world. And so to me, post-liberalism, you can tell lofty stories where people are firmly rooted in strong gods, which I think is the title of Rusty Reno's most recent book. And I do believe in strong gods. But in practice, post-liberalism is just authoritarianism, because the gangsters will take it over if you don't have democratic checks. Nonetheless, I do believe the central conservative truth is that the liberal democratic societies we love depend on pre-liberal institutions. That is to say, democracy and liberalism, 18th century liberalism, celebrates individual choice. But for people to feel secure morally, emotionally, spiritually, and socially, they need to be rooted in covenantal communities that precede choice. So we don't really choose our families. Most of us choose our nation. Coming to faith doesn't feel like a choice the way I would choose a Mazda instead of a Nissan. These are covenantal relationships. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died maybe 3-4 years ago, said a contract is about self-interest. A covenant is about identity. It's about transformation. And so I think one of the things our society has done, mostly since World War II, is weaken those covenantal relationships. The idea that there are things that precede choice. And if you go to commencement speeches, people say, find your own values, find your own truth. And if your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that, but most of us can't do it. And so we're left without a moral order. And one of my favorite sayings from psychology is from an attachment theorist, 20th century attachment theorist named John Bowlby. And he argued that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And that secure base is those covenantal relationships to your family, to your country, to your community, and to your faith, some creed. And you take that away from people, and people do not have a secure base. So, of course, they're going to feel existentially unsafe. And, of course, that's going to lead to fanaticism. Hannah Arendt said every form of fanaticism derives from loneliness and existential anxiety. And of course, it's going to lead people to try to cure the hole in their soul with politics. There's a guy named Ryan Streeter, who's now at the University of Texas, who did a study finding that people who identify as lonely are 7 times more likely to get active in politics than people who don't. And so politics seems to give you the illusion of belonging, like I'm a member of Team Red or Team Blue. You're not really in a community. You're not going to community meetings. You're just hating the same people. And politics seems to give you the illusion, which we all need, that we're involved in some righteous cause. But you're not sitting with a widow or serving the poor. You're just tweeting something nasty about your opponents. And so it gives you the illusion that it's going to fill the hole in your soul, but it just brings you to culture war.
It seems that there was a time in American life where becoming active in politics actually would have addressed some of the loneliness. At a time when what you would do is join a labor union, or you'd be on the picket line together, or the little ladies in tennis shoes that would join the John Birch Society. They're stuffing envelopes together, and that's really not an option right now for people.
Yeah, there was a great book written by a Harvard sociologist, very progressive lady named Theda Skocpol. And I think the book was written in the 2003 or so. I think it was called Diminished Democracy. And what she found was that people were not joining cross-class organizations that involved real meetings, like the Kiwanis Clubs, the Elks Lodge, the Ladies Auxiliary, whatever. They were joining clubs like the Sierra Club or the ACLU, which A, were only educated class people, and B, involved no meetings. It just involved sending in a check once a year. And so to me, the sending in a check is not community, but the real damaging thing was the lack of cross-class relationships. Because over the last, I would say 60 years, the educated class has insulated itself from the rest of society, going to places where everyone else is educated, joining organizations where everybody else is educated, going to workplaces. One of the shocking things, I confess it's about the New York Times, which of course I've loved. I've been there 23 years. But 55% of the editorial employees went to the same 32 elite colleges. And this is not a New York Times problem. This is an educated class problem. It's the same is true of the Wall Street Journal. The same is true, according to a study in Nature magazine, in Hollywood. The same is true in law. The same is true in the civil service. In elite sector after elite sector, roughly 55% of the people among those went to the same 32 elite colleges. There are 4,000 colleges in this country, and yet we have a talent pool, the only 32. And, everyone has a theory about why Donald Trump got reelected. Or my one-sentence explanation, it's not the only one, but it's the main one, or why Nigel Farage is doing so well in Britain, or Marine Le Pen in France, or Giorgia Meloni in Italy, or Viktor Orban, is that a lot of people took a look at the top 20% of the country and decided that those people have too much cultural power, too much economic power, too much political power, and they don't care a damn about us. We're invisible to them. And when you put people in that situation, people are going to flip the table. This was all anticipated 30 years ago now, by a book written by a named Christopher Lasch called The Revolt of the Elites. Every argument you hear from Steve Bannon, from Stephen Miller, from Donald Trump about how you've been betrayed, that's in that book from 30 years ago. And it's a reminder that if you want to change politics, you got to have activists, you got to have politicians, but it always starts with a book. It always starts with a set of intellectuals who said, this is wrong, and people lapse onto that vision. When I was with Buckley, the conservative movement started with people like Bill Buckley, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, and they met in 1948 beginning. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. It started with a book. MAGA started with The Revolt of the Elites and Pat Buchanan. So for Democrats, I would say, who want to fight Trumpism, don't ask your politicians to lead. They're busy fighting an election, raising money. You need a book. You need to understand that we are in a different historical era. There was an era in the 1917 that was all about revolution, fascism, and communism. In the 1930s, there was an era about the welfare state. Now we're in an era of global populism. You've got to adjust all your thinking to a new historical era, a new historical circumstance in which people feel betrayed. And if you're going back to your 1960s civil rights talk, if you're going back to your 1930s New Deal talk, those are great ways to talk, but it's not going to work in this era. And so I don't think Democrats realize the kind of pivotal shift they have to make. Just one final story on this little riff. About 10 years ago, I had a research assistant, a wonderful young man named James. And I go to his little desk at the Times, and there's Christopher Lasch's book, The Revolt of the Elites. And I think, why is James reading a 20-year-old book? At that point, it was only 20. So James is now J.D. Vance's chief speechwriter. And so he read that book, and something resonated, and his political him said, yeah, this rings true to me. And so I just emphasize the power of ideas in shifting political movements and the power of a historical zeitgeist. We're in a global populist zeitgeist. Deal with it. Democrats have to figure out how to say, yeah, the elites betrayed you, but we're going to still make it better for you, even though we're the part of the elites. And that is a hard square to circle, or circle to square, whatever it is.
Isn't it also difficult when a lot of the problem is vibe? I think that Democrats are often wanting to say, well, what we need are more populist policies or more popular policies, but the primary problem seems to be what Bob Inglis used to talk about when he would talk about trying to talk to his fellow conservatives about climate change, that there's almost a tissue rejection. There's just a incompatibility there. How can they address that when the problem really isn't ideas as much as feel?
This is another thing that drives me crazy about Democrats. They think if we only get the right policy, one advantage of being a religious person is you realize it's not the policies.
Hmm.
This seems true. This seems profoundly, profoundly true. And you say vibe, I would use a fancier word of culture.
Hmm.
And Donald Trump is not a set of policies. He's a culture. And what Donald Trump has the advantage of, he sees the world the way a lot of people see the world. And it's weird because he's a billionaire from New York. But if you know New York, as I do, being a person from Queens, even if you're a billionaire, is very different than being a person from Manhattan. And the resentments of somebody from Queens actually turns out dovetail with the resentments of a lot of people from West Virginia. And that they're resentful against the same elites and they sell the same story. And one thing that is so true about politics, I could dislike your politics. I could disbelieve most of the things you tell me. But if the story you're telling me feels true, then you're my man.
Hmm.
And if you see the world generally the way I see the world, you're my man. And in an age of intense social distrust, Trump sees the world the way a lot of people, and you're not going to get rid of him or get people to move away from him because you disagree with his policy on Ukraine, as heinous as well. Now it's a little better than it was 2 months ago, but it policies are not first. Worldview and culture is first. And
Let me
respect.
test out a theory on you. I've been hearing over the past couple of days from pro-Trump evangelical friends with whom I disagree on Trump, but for whom Access Hollywood was no problem. January 6th was no problem. The criminal convictions, no problem. Jeffrey Epstein is a problem for them. I don't think that'll last. I think tribalism will kick in, but it is a problem for them right now. My theory is that that's largely because they started thinking about Epstein in the context of an elite. The way the conversation first started with them is this is a group of billionaires flying each other around to these islands and doing these horrible things. And Trump only comes into it second step. And so now that he's telling them, "Oh, this is all a hoax. Don't worry about it." That's why that's not working. Am I seeing that correctly?
I think you're right. I mean, my first when this Epstein thing started bubbling, I wanted to pull my hair out, what's left of it, and say China is overtaking us in pretty much every scientific endeavor. China is overtaking us in pretty much every tech endeavor, including AI. So why don't we focus on the big picture here and not Jeffrey Epstein, a guy who's dead and, as Trump says, never seems to die. But I do think Epstein became, I'm going to make a weird analogy, for people on the hard left, the Palestinians became a symbol of everything. The Palestinians were a symbol of European colonialism, of rich versus poor, of oppressor versus oppressed. And so that became the symbol for them of all their belief systems. And for people who think the elites are fundamentally corrupt and depraved, well, Jeffrey Epstein personifies that or personified that. And so I think I was wrong to think that Epstein is not an important issue. He represents a worldview where Epstein personified elite corruption and elite depravity. And I should say that I have a lot of friends and family members who were very pro-Trump, and I have not lost a friendship. I've somehow maintained, I think you have too, I've just maintained friendships even across while we argue about this or that Trump policy. And I have a family member who sometimes tweets me, "How much do I have to pay you to get you to stop writing?" Because I'll be bashing Trump, and he'll say, like, "This is crazy." But I do think, as someone who has been in the American elite for 30 or 40 years, we have ignored and betrayed a lot of America. But Jeffrey Epstein is not typical. He was a uniquely depraved figure, and that whole world was a uniquely depraved world. But he was successful in insinuating himself into all sorts of elite quarters with all sorts of people, sometimes people who are like admirable scholars. And so it shows a moral obtuseness on the part of a lot of people in the American establishment that they did not recognize that what a bad seed this guy was. And that is a reflection on the American elite. And I sort of understand why people want to use Epstein as a cudgel with which to beat the entire establishment.
But why, while you and I are talking, Trump has been today attacking MAGA,
Yeah.
and saying they're dupes for talking about Epstein. We need to stop talking about it. We need to make it go away. Why is that the case for him?
Yeah, well, he, of course, is with his people in some ways, but not in any case where he himself was involved, as in his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein.
Mm.
But I guess what's been interesting to me is to watch every administration, two things, to watch every administration eventually go to war with its people. And, you know, I was at National Review in 1983, 84, 85. And we decided early on that Ronald Reagan was a traitor to conservatism, was willing to talk to Mikhail Gorbachev.
Hmm.
And so we were on the rampage against Ronald Reagan. People whitewash that now, but that was absolutely the case. And it's with that, the left decided that Bill Clinton was a sellout early on. Barack Obama was a sellout early on. You can never go far left for somebody. And, you know, Barry Goldwater was, you know, he displeased the Goldwater rates
Hmm.
because basically working politicians believe a lot less than you think they do. Some of them have convictions, but most have a feel. They know what's good for them at that moment. And Trump is a pretty successful working politician, and he has a feel. And so he's not going to want him to be suborned to the true believers. I've actually been a little shocked in how much he has enacted Heritage's Project 2025. Because I had thought he'd get in office and say, I'm not letting those pencil-headed geeks tell me how to run my administration. He's done a lot more. But on the same hand, he has backtracked on the tariffs. He's backtracked on some of the mass deportation stuff. He's a political creature with an extremely short attention span. So it doesn't surprise me that there's infighting. The second thing I'll say is, and this happened in the first Trump term, we had some friends over, some who worked in the Trump administration and some who worked in the Obama administration. And one of the people who worked in the Trump administration asked one of the people who had worked in the Obama administration, did you guys have a sense of camaraderie in your administration? And the Obama people said, yeah, every White House has an intense sense of camaraderie. You're a band of brothers there. You're getting there at 6 a.m. You're not leaving till 8 p.m. It's you. You're all in there together. And the Trump person looked bewildered, and she said, we have none of that.
Hmm.
And every White House I've covered is intensely shaped, the culture of it is intensely shaped by the person at the top. I go to those rooms year after year, decade after decade, interviewing people, and it's the same rooms, but the culture shifts so much. And I think Trump is just not somebody who engenders mutual loyalty because he doesn't display it himself. And so when you get that in administration, there's going to be more backfighting than normal.
You know, it seems that so many times in American history, people have responded by reacting to the last president. So you have old Eisenhower replaced by JFK, you have Obama replaced by Trump, Obama's replacing George W. Bush. Do you think that the American people are going to want to go in the opposite direction, meaning sort of a Pete Buttigieg smart person who could claim to fix all of the problems in the AI era, or or are we in a time when sort of the reality TV show model is going to be across the board the way we operate?
Yeah, I think there are two things to be said. I read or listened to a podcast it was Yasha Monk's podcast with a Romanian intellectual, and I've forgotten the name of the guy. But the point he made was we're in a revolutionary situation. Donald Trump is a political revolution. And once the revolution happens, you can't go back to the pre-revolution. And he made the point the Democratic Party is going to change as much as the Republican Party has changed. And he made the way he put it, for those who know Russian history, he said you can have Kerensky before Lenin, but you can't have Lenin before Kerensky.
Hmm.
And Kerensky was an early democratic leader of Russia. After the Tsar fell, they tried a democratic government that didn't work. That was Kerensky. And then Lenin leads a revolution, and he changes everything about Russian politics. And so there was no way to go back to the moderate Kerensky after you had the radical Marxist. And so I do think there's going to be a fundamental shift as everybody, including the Democrats, have to take on the points Donald Trump is right about, that the elites really did betray you. And the Democrats have to find a story. So I do think they can't go back to, in my view, Pete Buttigieg unless Pete Buttigieg changes. You have to go forward to something new. And I'm humble. I don't like this guy Mondani in New York, that's Democratic Socialist running for mayor. But maybe that's the future. I mean, there was a way that the socialism, whether it's AOC or Bernie Sanders, is built on a lot of the same distrust of elites that Donald Trump is. So maybe that's the future. The one thing I'd say to argue against that is that Americans are still Americans. And if you do deep polling and you say, the guy named Richard Schroeder at the University of Chicago just did this, do you believe in multiculturalism? Do you believe America should be a pluralist society? Do you believe that people who are white Christians should know people who are black, people who are secular? All amazing percentages of Americans, 70% or higher, say, yes, I believe in pluralism. I believe in multiculturalism. White Christians strongly believe in pluralism and multiculturalism. They have diversity in their own lives, and they believe in it. And so that's still true. Second, if you ask people, do you think immigrants are good for America? Well, the number of people who believe that is now at a record high.
Mm.
Do you believe America has an international role in the world in promoting democracy and human rights? 70-odd% of Americans say yes. So one of the weird things about Trumpism, on some fundamental values, he's out of step with America and out of step with the DNA, the cultural DNA of America. And so I think the mood shift I would look for is really what is dark world, which is Trump world, American carnage. You can't trust anybody. The foreigners are out to get us. I do think lurking somewhere in there is the same old American hope that we're the last best hope of Earth. The future will be better. We can build a better future. We're surrounded by opportunity. We're a people of plenty. And I think from a shift to dark pessimism to open, renewed hope by the right kind of leader who can bring that hope, I think there's a big market for that.
You know, there was a brief conversation that I cannot get out of my mind. Your colleague, Ezra Klein, on his show, was talking about Mamdani and about how he is a TikTok age politician, in the sense that if you look at the Andrew Cuomo announcement that he's going to continue running, and he tries to do these videos, but it's just so obviously not his feel. Mamdani could do that and could do it very well. And Klein's thesis was Trump is a Twitter age politician, and Twitter is built for conflict by the very nature of it. TikTok isn't. Whatever you think about TikTok, it's more about kind of day in the life sort of lightheartedness. Maybe the medium is signaling a shift to an entirely lighter sort of kind of discourse. Do you think that might be true?
That might be that. I'm less of a technological determinist than my friend and colleague Ezra, I think. So he and plus I'm a little out of the game. I've tried TikTok and I find it so ridiculously addictive. I have to get off. And so I read Ezra and I read a great writer, Substacker, Noah Smith, and they see through the lens of the technological change. Maybe, and obviously it's had a huge effect. But I guess the point I'd make is politicians do well when they throw themselves on the audience. And if anybody who is afraid of public speaking, the one bit of advice I'd give them, throw yourself on the audience. They will hold you up. Show vulnerability. Be your natural self. Lay down on the audience the way you see a rock star crowd surfing at a concert. They will hold you up. If you are unable to throw yourself on the audience because you're too formal or too distant, they sense that. And Mitt Romney is a wonderful human being. But when he ran for office as president, he did not throw himself on the audience. And so they sense that, and they sense that distance. And I think Cuomo, his father, did. He spoke from the heart in a very natural way. But if you're overly calculating, overly ambitious, unwilling to just be who you are, I think people can sense that no matter what the medium is.
You and I had a conversation one time years ago. You just sort of parenthetically said in our book club meeting that you had been talking to Silicon Valley executives and leaders about AI, and that about half of them were talking in really utopian terms, and about half of them were talking in terrifyingly dystopian terms. I mean, you mentioned China being so far ahead of us on all of this. I think that people sense we're moving into a different time. One person's described it as an axial decade with AI. What can be done? to prepare people for this, do you think?
Yeah, I think America still has a bit of a lead on China, but the DeepSeek that bot, the problem is they can make it at 1/17th of the price. So
Hmm.
that's their innovation, and now Alibaba, a bunch of the Chinese LLMs have they're peers of the American ones. So I think that's a problem. I mean, AI is probably going to be the dominating technology in the next several decades, and whoever can get the world to use their model first will have like what Google has or what Amazon has, that huge advantage of being first and conquering the market. It'll be very hard to knock them off. And so I'm a little worried that we're not going fast enough, frankly. But I think what's changed in the time when I first started talking to AI executives, they were enthralled by the technology itself. Now, in 2025, in the summertime, everyone is grappling with the effect that it's already having. And you are beginning, and all the economists told us, don't worry, it takes so long for a new technology to permeate the workforce. People would say electricity took 30 years. Air conditioning took 30 years. Computers took a long time. There was a famous quote that computers show up everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, because it took people a long time to figure out how to use these new technologies. Well, guess what? That's not happening. People are using it quickly. And if you're just out of college, I know you don't need me to tell you this. If you're trying to get a white collar job just out of college, it's brutally hard now. And so that's because AI is already having an effect. And I can't tell you what the effect's going to be in the next 10 years. I'm comforted by the fact that while I believe my friends who are physicists and economists that AI is really good at helping them think through their problems, in the sorts of things I write about, which are psychology, culture, faith, politics, AI is terrible. AI just hoovers up all the mediocre stuff that's anywhere on the web about, like I'm writing a book on desire and motivation. So it hoovers up all the crap that's out there on the web and it gives you utter banalities. So I find it completely useless. And so I'm somewhat comforted by the fact that I think AI will show us humans who we are by revealing what it can't do. And I do not believe that AI is going to get to artificial general intelligence, that it's going to beat us at everything, because AI has no understanding, it has no emotions, it has no motives, it has no creativity really, though it can mimic creativity. It can mimic emotions, but it's incapable of actual intimacy. And so I think it's going to be a tool, but I'm a little less scared. But for those, I'm glad I'm in my 60s and not entering the job market, because that really, if you're 23, 25, it's clear within the next 5 years, it's going to have massive effects. And then they'll be tumultuous. And if past this prologue, every old technology creates new jobs that we can't imagine at the moment. And I assume this will happen, but it's going to be tough sledding. I think we've become much more real. The doomsters and the utopians have gone away. Now it's like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's strong, and that's good and bad.
So if a 22-year-old David Brooks out there somewhere writing a satirical piece on you with at the end, can you spare a dime? I'm
Yeah.
looking for a job. Uh, you actually think there is a future for human thought. You would tell that person to keep pressing, not that this entire sort of world will go away and
Yeah,
replaced by AI.
I would say have a very distinct voice. Like AI is never going to be Joan Didion, Tom
Hmm.
Wolfe, or William F. Buckley. So cultivate a distinct voice, cultivate a distinct view of the world, cultivate your social skills. AI is never going to be able to do intimacy. So there are all sorts of skills human beings have. Cultivate motivation, cultivate curiosity. If I did a column, what does David Brooks think of Russell Moore, and I throw it into ChatGPT, it would give a plausible thing. But hopefully, in thinking about you for a week before writing a column, I would have had new thoughts. And
Hmm.
AI doesn't do that. It doesn't come up with, it can combine thoughts, but it doesn't really have breakthrough. And so curiosity and the capacity to lifelong learn is just tremendously powerful. And then, frankly, when I look at young people, define intelligence differently. We have vastly overvalued academic intelligence. It's not important. Having good SAT scores and good grades is not the same as wisdom. It's not the same as judgment. There's zero correlation between IQ and judgment. And so think of all those other things that are actually make you a good human being or a wise person. And those are different than anything AI. And the final thing I'll say is, and I tell this to young people, think about jobs where you're going to somebody's house and fixing their air conditioning. Maybe that's not what you thought you'd do with a philosophy degree, but that's a damn good job. And I'm this conscious of me because my air conditioning just broke, and I had a wonderful guy come and fix it. He was wonderful. He understood things deeply. He knew that his first solution was not the right one. And those kind of jobs are not going away. That kind of direct face-to-face service. And so, just practically, widen your horizon of what a real job is going to be and what a satisfying job is going to be for you.
And how about preaching? You mentioned going around to different churches and hearing preaching. What kind of advice would you give to preachers?
Well, I'd give what I said earlier, which was teach me something. Take out a verse and go to the internet and find interesting disagreements about it. One advantage of having a Jewish background is arguing about verses is something that's woven into the fabric of life. And it's a good way to just be creative. But the other thing I'll say is, and I mentioned this phrase earlier in our conversation, I was writing a column years ago about how hard it was to teach character formation in a classroom. And then some guy, a veterinarian from Oregon named Dave Jolly, sent me an email, and he says, never forget what a wise person says is the least of that which they give. That what gets communicated is who they are in the smallest of their gestures. Never forget the message is the person. And that phrase, the message is the person, he wrote that to me in the early days of Pope Francis's papacy. And I remember the whole world, whether they're Catholic or not, especially in the early days before politics got in there, was really drawn to Pope Francis. And it was a reminder to me, and I was not a person of faith back in those days, that people just are innately drawn to anybody who's trying to live like Jesus. And I would say that natural human connection in pastoring is not going away. And so if you tell the kind of sermon that I could get off GPT, well, then maybe you got a problem. But if you've got a creative sermon, if you've got something out of your heart, if you've got something that grapples with disagreement. I had a friend, I went to a wonderful church, but I had a friend who had very high standards for sermons. And so I would see him dip out when the sermon started. And he'd go outside, he'd put in headphones, and head listen to a Tim Keller sermon. And then 45 minutes later, he'd come back in and resume the service. And so I sort of understood where it was coming from, but it wasn't part of being part of the community.
It's kind of a reverse C.S. Lewis who wanted to leave during the singing and come in for the sermon.
Right, yeah. This is a particular problem with writers. I know Samuel Johnson, the 17th or 18th century essayist, he was such a brilliant human being and a great essayist and a really believing Christian that it was very hard to tell a sermon that was going to live up to Samuel Johnson's problem or his standards. So he had trouble with sermons because his standards were so high.
I wanted to ask you about your piece on novels, which I'll link in the show notes, but I went too long, so we're out of time. But I'm wondering if you had to recommend a novel to a young person who's trying to think through these issues of character formation and curiosity and imagination and so forth, what would you recommend?
That's a very good question. I mean, I would read the essays of read the essays of Johnson. I'm now thinking this is more a middle-aged person's novel, but Middlemarch, George Eliot's book. Mm-hmm. She is a brilliant characterizer of character, and she has so many rich characters. For me, it was Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Somebody made the point that British novels have a few main characters, and Russian novels have, and then everyone else is a block character, a simple character. Mm-hmm. Russian novels have no simple characters. They're all full characters. And especially if they're in a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky novel, they are filled with spiritual yearning. They are Levin in Anna Karenina, Prince Andrei in War and Peace. These are characters whose soul is active and hunger, and you see spiritual anguish. And if you never experienced that, to be in contact with spiritual anguish, Pierre in War and Peace, it's like, oh, this is the most important thing. The state of my soul is the most important thing. And then the final novel I'll mention, and again, this may be more for older folks, is a Wallace Stegner novel called Crossing to Safety,
Oh, yeah.
which I recommend to people. And it's about two lifelong friendships. And nothing happens in the novel, but it's gripping throughout the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about just people who are friends through the course of their life. And the one thing, this is not worthy of the greatness of that novel, but there's a conversation between two of the male friends, and it's two couples. And one of them is a literature professor, and one of them is a novelist. And the novelist says to the literature professor, and they're talking about what they've been reading, and the novelist says, you have to understand, you read to appreciate, I read to steal. And as a columnist, I can tell you when I'm reading something, I'm really reading to steal, because what can I quote that will be helpful to me? And I think pastors are a little like this. So like, they have something happens with their wife, they had a fight, and they can, I can get a sermon out of this.
Last question. When you think about the age we're in right now, and you had to pick one biblical book that sort of represents this era, are we in more of an Ecclesiastes sort of time, more of a Jeremiah sort of time, or in more of a Proverbs sort of time?
Yeah. I've been meditating like everybody on the parable of the Good Samaritan because I wrote a book on seeing, and only the Samaritan sees the injured guy by the side of the road. And so that's been, but I think to a degree that's underappreciated, we're in an Exodus kind of time. And that, in my view, any relationship with your spouse, with your kids, with your God, or with your friends, grows through a process of rupture and repair. You have to go through hardship, and then it's the process of repairing where you really build the relationship. I think America goes through periods of rupture and repair. The 1770s, we had to tear everything down and repair. 1830s, the populists tore everything down, we repair. 1890s, we had to tear down how badly we were responding to industrialization, repair. 1960s, we tore down the culture of the 1950s, repair. And so I think we're in a period of rupture and repair, and that's a journey. And Exodus, they escape oppression. In the wilderness, they get lost. They're worshiping the golden calf. And then repair. And so a new consciousness, there's a saying ascribed to Albert Einstein, which unfortunately he did not actually say, which is that you're not going to solve your problem at the same level of consciousness at which you created it. You have to go through another level of consciousness. And Exodus is really about that. It's about creating a people capable of freedom. And so we're going through a period of rupture, and I think it'll be a period of repair. So it seems like Ecclesiastes because it's a dark and pessimistic time. But, the promised land is somewhere out there. I firmly believe that because America's been through this so many times before.
David Brooks, always good to have you with us. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk with you on or off the air.